At the gala's spotlight moment, billionaire Evelyn Grant sneered at Amara Johnson's outstretched hand and refused to shake it, dismissing her as staff. What Evelyn didn't know, Amara was the silent force behind a 5B deal that could make, or completely break, Evelyn's empire. The room never truly recovered from the moment Evelyn Grant refused Amara Johnson's handshake. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, the unveiling of a monumental business deal that would shift industries and set new standards. Instead, the air was charged with unease. Guests tried to continue their conversations, but the image of Evelyn's smug refusal lingered like smoke. Cameras had caught it, journalists had noticed, and even if Evelyn didn't realize it yet, her reputation had already begun to crack. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, satisfied, sipping from her glass of wine as though she had established dominance. She was a billionaire, after all, used to commanding respect wherever she went. To her, Amara was nothing more than a distraction, someone whose presence didn't align with the image of power she had carefully cultivated. What Evelyn didn't know, and what everyone else was quickly beginning to realize, was that Amara wasn't simply attending the gala. She was the anchor of the entire deal. The executives around the table shifted in discomfort. Some were old allies of Evelyn's, accustomed to her sharp tongue and superiority complex, but tonight felt different. Tonight, her arrogance wasn't directed at competitors or rivals. It was aimed at someone essential. More than a few eyes darted toward Amara, silently measuring her response. Would she retaliate? Would she call Evelyn out in front of everyone? But Amara stayed silent, her composure flawless. She didn't need to lash out or make a scene. Her power wasn't in words. It was in the signatures, the contracts, the investments lined up and waiting. While Evelyn laughed off the moment, Amara was already 3 steps ahead, fully aware that the night was hers to command. As the waiters began serving the main course, whispers grew louder at nearby tables. "Did you see that?" one delegate murmured to another. "She refused her handshake, with cameras right there." Another leaned closer. "Does Evelyn even know who she just insulted?" That was the heart of it. Evelyn had no clue. To her, Amara was invisible, a figure she could dismiss without thought. She didn't recognize her as the investor who had spent years carefully building influence in quiet, strategic ways. She didn't realize that without Amara's financial backing, the very deal she'd been bragging about to the press would collapse overnight. Evelyn was about to learn a brutal truth. Money and arrogance might win headlines, but respect was what secured legacies. Then came Evelyn's next mistake. As conversation turned to the significance of the 5B deal, she leaned across the table, speaking loudly enough for half the room to hear. "You know," she said with a smirk tugging at her lips, "deals like this require real leadership, people with vision, pedigree, and experience, not charity cases." The remark was thinly veiled, but everyone at the table understood who it was aimed at. Forks clinked against plates, and for a heartbeat, the table was silent. Amara didn't flinch. She simply took a sip of water, her eyes meeting Evelyn's with calm indifference. The power in that silence spoke louder than any protest could. What Evelyn failed to realize was that her words weren't just cruel, they were strategic suicide. Several high-profile investors at the table, men and women who had long tolerated Evelyn's arrogance for the sake of profit, were visibly uncomfortable. Deals depended not only on money but also on image, reputation, and trust. And in one evening, Evelyn was dismantling her own. Meanwhile, Amara's silence was winning her allies. The executives admired her restraint, the way she carried herself with dignity in the face of blatant disrespect. Behind the scenes, they were already recalculating loyalties. Power didn't always announce itself. It revealed itself in moments like this. And so, as the night stretched on, Evelyn kept talking, unaware that every arrogant remark only tightened the noose around her empire. She boasted about her wealth, flaunted her connections, and laughed as though she were untouchable. But in reality, she was already losing ground, because every person in that room knew what Evelyn did not. The fate of the entire deal rested in Amara Johnson's hands. But that wasn't the whole story. What came next would shift the night from whispers and tension to open revelation. The moment when Amara's true role would be revealed, and when Evelyn Grant would realize she had insulted not just a guest, but the very force capable of dismantling her billion-dollar empire. The tension in the boardroom reached its breaking point. Amara Johnson, her composure unwavering, leaned forward and tapped her fingers lightly on the polished mahogany table. Her eyes locked on Margaret Whitmore, the billionaire who had refused her handshake earlier. The entire boardroom seemed to hold its breath, sensing a confrontation unlike any they had witnessed before. "Ms. Whitmore," Amara said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "you dismissed me the moment I walked into this room. But perhaps now is the time you understand who I am and why your refusal speaks louder than any words." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder, placing it directly in front of the executives. "This," she continued, "is the finalized agreement for the $5 billion infrastructure deal between my company, Horizon Global, and your financial consortium. Without my endorsement, this deal collapses." Gasps echoed across the table. Executives shifted in their seats, whispering furiously, their faces paling as they realized the gravity of the situation. For weeks, Margaret had positioned herself as the key player, boasting about her wealth, her power, and her network. But in a single moment, Amara revealed that everything rested on her. Margaret's eyes widened. Her confident smirk evaporated, replaced with visible discomfort. She attempted to regain her composure, straightening her pearl necklace, but her voice trembled. You're telling me you have the authority to kill this deal?" Amara did not flinch. "Not just the authority, the responsibility. My team, my investors, and the nations relying on this deal trust me to protect their interests. And believe me, Ms. Whitmore, I do not take that responsibility lightly." The room turned hostile, not toward Amara, but toward Margaret. Executives who had once nodded in approval at Margaret's arrogance now glared at her with disdain. They understood the stakes. Billions in profit, global reputations, and future opportunities depended on Amara's decision. Margaret stammered, searching for words. I didn't mean any offense. It was just a misunderstanding." Amara's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "A misunderstanding? When you refused my hand in front of this board, you sent a message. You dismissed me because of my skin, because of who I am. But let me be clear, I do not bend to prejudice, not here, not anywhere." The silence was deafening. Every executive waited for Amara's verdict. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her presence commanding the room. "The deal can proceed, but only if there are conditions. Diversity in leadership, accountability in decision-making, and a recognition that respect is not optional, it's mandatory. If these terms are not met, Horizon Global walks away, and so does $5 billion. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Papers shuffled, executives argued, and phones buzzed. Margaret sat frozen, humiliated, realizing her arrogance had destroyed her credibility. For Amara, this was not just business. This was justice. The weight of Amara Johnson's words lingered like a storm cloud over the boardroom. Executives who had once sat confidently behind Margaret Whitmore now scrambled, whispering to one another, their carefully crafted alliances fracturing in real time. The arrogance that had once filled the room had been replaced with unease as the reality of Amara's power settled in. Margaret, visibly shaken, sat rigid in her chair. Her hands clutched the arms of her seat as if holding on for stability. She had built her empire on intimidation and exclusion, never once imagining that someone she dismissed could turn the tide against her so decisively. One of the senior executives, a man named Victor, broke the silence. Ms. Johnson, he said carefully, leaning forward, we recognize the gravity of your terms. Frankly, they are more than reasonable, and I believe I speak for many here when I say we are prepared to adapt. A few other executives nodded in agreement, but all eyes still darted nervously toward Margaret, the so-called titan of the room who now looked more like an outcast. Amara kept her composure, her voice steady and analytical. This isn't about me. It's about the values we embed in this deal. You cannot expect to conduct international business while clinging to outdated prejudices. If Horizon Global is to partner with you, it will be on principles of respect, inclusion, and accountability. The firmness in her words resonated. Several executives who had remained silent throughout the meeting finally spoke up, supporting Amara's conditions. What had started as Margaret's arena had turned into Amara's platform for change. Margaret, desperate to reclaim her footing, tried to interject. This is ridiculous. You're making this personal. We're here to talk business, not moral lectures. Amara turned her gaze directly to her, calm, yet piercing. Business and morality are not separate, Ms. Whitmore. They intersect in every decision, every partnership, and every outcome. If we ignore that, then what exactly are we building with these billions? Just numbers on paper or something with real impact? Her words silenced Margaret once more, leaving the billionaire with no shield to hide behind. The very empire she had used to intimidate others was crumbling under the weight of her own actions. Across the table, more voices aligned with Amara's position. Victor spoke again, this time with conviction. If we want this deal to succeed, we need leadership like Ms. Johnson's. Frankly, Margaret, your behavior has compromised our credibility. The board must reconsider its stance moving forward. It was the first time anyone had dared challenge Margaret so openly, and it signaled the shift of power. Amara let the words sink in, her expression neutral, but her presence undeniable. She had not raised her voice, yet her influence had reshaped the entire room. For her, the victory wasn't about humiliating Margaret. It was about setting a precedent that prejudice had no place in billion-dollar decisions. The boardroom had been transformed. The executives, once complicit in silence, now rallied behind principles they could no longer ignore. Margaret, once the strongest voice, had been reduced to a symbol of what happens when arrogance collides with accountability. Amara had won the battle. But more importantly, she had changed the narrative. The meeting adjourned, but the echoes of what had transpired reverberated far beyond that boardroom. For the executives, the deal had transformed from a mere transaction into a lesson in integrity. For Margaret Whitmore, it was a humiliating reminder that power built on arrogance is fragile when confronted with truth. As Amara Johnson walked out, her head held high, the contrast was striking. She had entered the room as an outsider in the eyes of many, dismissed and underestimated. Yet she left as the architect of a new standard, one that insisted respect and fairness were not optional add-ons to business, but the foundation upon which true progress could be built. The story spread quickly, whispered through corporate circles, and reported in financial news. Not because of the billions at stake, but because of the symbolism. A black woman, disregarded at first sight, had forced one of the world's most powerful billionaires to confront her own prejudice. Margaret retreated into silence, her influence diminished. But for Amara, this was never about revenge. It was about ensuring that the future of business, whether 5 billion or 5 trillion, would not belong to those who clung to outdated hierarchies, but to those who valued dignity and equality. And that is where the true impact of this moment lies. It was not the signing of a contract that mattered most, but the rewriting of the unspoken rules. In that boardroom, a single handshake denied had given way to a revolution of perspective. Because sometimes it only takes one act of courage, one refusal to bow to arrogance, for the world to change its course.